On the 10th of May 1508, Michelangelo Buonarroti began working on painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome after being commissioned by Pope Julius II. He finished the initial work in 1512 and returned again in 1535 to paint the Last Judgment. This is one of the world's most iconic works of art, yet Michelangelo viewed himself as a sculptor rather than a painter. How did someone who did not even primarily consider himself to be a painter by trade produce some of the most famous paintings in human history? This is the story of Michelangelo, painter of the Sistine Chapel. The man known to history as Michelangelo was born Michelangelo di Ludovico Buonarroti Simoni on the 6th of March 1475 in the village of Caprese in the upper Tiber Valley near Arezzo in eastern Tuscany. The village was later named Caprese Michelangelo in the artist's honor. The painter is generally known simply as Michelangelo. Michelangelo's father was Ludovico Buonarroti. He served as a chief magistrate or podestà of Caprese on behalf of the Republican government of Florence, the city that ruled over most of Tuscany in the 15th century. Michelangelo later claimed that the family were descended from Countess Matilda of Canossa, a prominent 11th century power broker who supported the papacy against the Holy Roman Empire in the investiture controversy. Despite this claim, the family's lineage can only be reliably traced to some 13th century Florentine wool merchants. While several Buonarrotis held high office in Florence, by the time of Michelangelo's birth, the family's status was in decline, and Ludovico was later disqualified from serving the government after falling into debt in the 1480s. Michelangelo's mother, Francesca di Neri di Miniato del Serra, was in her late teens when she married Ludovico Buonarroti. Francesca was related to the prominent Rucellai family, but otherwise very little is known about her. She gave birth to her first son, Leonardo, in 1473, 2 years before Michelangelo's birth in 1475. Over the next 6 years, she had 3 more sons, Buonarrotto, Giovanni Simone, and Sigismondo. She died in 1481, likely from complications following the birth of her youngest son. Ludovico's term as podestà of Caprese ended a few weeks after Michelangelo's birth, and the family returned to Florence. A compact city with a population of 60,000 people, Florence was not only a powerful city-state, but an artistic and intellectual powerhouse that set the stage for the Italian Renaissance. The poet Dante wrote his Divine Comedy here in the 13th century, a landmark work in the inception of the Italian Renaissance. His contemporary Giotto designed the iconic bell tower of Florence Cathedral in the 1330s. A century later, the architect Filippo Brunelleschi designed and built the cathedral's iconic octagonal dome, the largest since antiquity. While Florence was officially a republic at the time of Michelangelo's birth, the city was dominated by the Medici banking family, who had translated their wealth into political power. Ludovico Buonarroti and his brother Francesco lived with their families in a rented house on the Via de' Bentacordi in the east of the city near the church of Santa Croce, which was already teeming with masterpieces by Florentine artists such as Giotto and the sculptor Donatello. Outside the church, the young Michelangelo would have encountered a wall of color as the city's dyers hung their fabric out to dry in open sheds. Michelangelo's familiarity with textiles, their coloring and design, would have helped him as a painter. During his earliest years, Michelangelo was brought up by a wet nurse at the family farm in the nearby village of Settignano. The area was known for its quarries, and Michelangelo later reflected that it was no coincidence that he became a sculptor. While Michelangelo returned to Florence after being weaned from his wet nurse, he frequently accompanied his family on trips to Settignano during his childhood. In around 1485, when Michelangelo was 10 years old, Ludovico sent him to study Latin grammar with Francesco da Urbino. This was a sign of the family's social ambitions, since a Latin education paved the path to a career in law, government, or the church. Despite Ludovico's aspirations for his son, Michelangelo was far more interested in becoming an artist. As a young child, he enjoyed copying Giotto's frescoes at Santa Croce, and at around 10 years old, he befriended Francesco Granacci, a young artist 5 years his senior, who was then working in the workshop of the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio. Granacci encouraged Michelangelo's artistic aspirations by inviting him to Ghirlandaio's studio and giving him drawings to copy, and the boy soon abandoned his Latin lessons. While Florence was a well-established centre of art, not all Florentines respected artists, and Ludovico regularly beat his son for preferring art over a more respectable career. Nevertheless, by 1487, the 12-year-old Michelangelo joined Granacci as an apprentice in Ghirlandaio's workshop. Ghirlandaio was then at the height of his fame, and Michelangelo may have helped him decorate the main chapel at the church of Santa Maria Novella. As an apprentice, Michelangelo learned fresco and panel painting techniques from Ghirlandaio, but he later sought to distance himself from his master, whose expertise in portraiture and scenes from daily life was diametrically opposed to Michelangelo's interest in grander subjects. Michelangelo developed his skills as an artist by drawing on paper, which was now in great abundance as paper mills sprung up to meet demand, following Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press. The mastery of forms Michelangelo developed through drawing was crucial in his later work as a sculptor and architect. Michelangelo was a proactive student who experimented with different media rather than copying what was in front of him. After being shown Martin Schongauer's engraving showing the Temptation of St. Anthony, Michelangelo made a color version by creating a painting based on Schongauer's original illustration. Michelangelo's authorized biographer, Ascanio Condivi, writing within the artist's lifetime, described the young apprentice copying a drawing by Ghirlandaio and returning the copy to his master, who was none the wiser until one of the other apprentices revealed Michelangelo's deception. Ghirlandaio may not have taken kindly to the student's efforts to outsmart his master, but he recognized Michelangelo's talent and gave him his big break in 1490 by introducing him and Granacci to Lorenzo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence, nicknamed Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent. In addition to exercising power over the city from behind the scenes, Lorenzo was a great patron of the arts with an extensive art collection. He hoped to rebuild Florence in the classical style and asked Ghirlandaio for his most talented apprentices to be trained as sculptors. When the two young artists arrived at Lorenzo's sculpture garden in San Marco in spring 1490, they found another apprentice sculptor named Pietro Torrigiano at work on some clay figures. While Michelangelo appears to have had no experience with sculpture before working for Lorenzo, he was confident enough to challenge Torrigiano by making his own clay figures. 3 years older than Michelangelo, Torrigiano resented the challenge, and their rivalry eventually turned violent when Michelangelo made a disparaging remark about Torrigiano's artistic abilities, provoking the latter to punch him in the face, permanently disfiguring his nose. Sculpture became Michelangelo's preferred art form, and he later described conceiving a figure in a marble block in his imagination and removing the material to realize its form. Michelangelo was trained by the sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni, a pupil of Donatello, who was also Lorenzo's art consultant. By the time Bertoldo died in December 1491, Michelangelo had far surpassed his master. Not long after Michelangelo began working for Lorenzo, he saw an ancient head of an old laughing faun and decided to make a version of his own with the faun's mouth fully open. When Lorenzo came across Michelangelo polishing his sculpture, he was impressed by the teenager's talents, but could not avoid remarking that he had given an old man a full set of teeth. Michelangelo was stung by the criticism, waited for Lorenzo to move on, so he could knock out a few of the teeth and show him his amended creation. Lorenzo admired Michelangelo's skill and ambition and moved him into one of the Medici residences in the city. He also requested to meet with the artist's father, who was initially terrified by the summons and horrified that his son was being trained as a sculptor. When Lorenzo promised to help Ludovico secure any government appointment he desired, the latter requested a modest sinecure in the customs office, a pitiful request that embarrassed his son. Michelangelo was proud of being treated as an equal in the Medici household and shared the dinner table with distinguished Florentine intellectuals. However, unlike some of his peers, he did not share the Medici court's interest in music and preferred to focus on his sculpting, copying many pieces by Donatello. With access to the extensive Medici art collection, Michelangelo also took inspiration from classical art. His earliest surviving sculptural works include a shallow-cut piece inspired by Donatello's reliefs known as the Madonna of the Stairs, and an unfinished piece known as the Battle of the Centaurs, depicting a dramatic classical scene. On the 9th of April 1492, Lorenzo the Magnificent died at the relatively young age of 43. Michelangelo was distraught by the demise of his patron, but he was initially well regarded by Lorenzo's son and successor, Piero de' Medici. Michelangelo is believed to have carved a large marble statue of Hercules as a commission from Piero. This statue ended up in the garden of Fontainebleau Palace in France, but disappeared in the early 18th century when the garden was refurbished. Piero also asked Michelangelo to work on a wooden sculpture of Christ on the cross for the Church of Santo Spirito, whose prior allowed Michelangelo to dissect the bodies of deceased patients in the adjoining hospital for his anatomical studies, an action that was considered a serious crime by many people at the time. The resulting creation appears elongated and out of proportion, though on closer examination it effectively conveys Christ's suffering. Despite enjoying Piero's favour, Michelangelo was also sympathetic to a party who questioned Piero's political abilities and hoped to replace him with Lorenzo and Giovanni di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, who hailed from the dynasty's junior branch. In September 1494, 2 years into Piero's rule, the Italian peninsula was rocked by an invasion by King Charles VIII of France, who laid claim to the Kingdom of Naples. After Piero sided with Naples, the French army marched on Florence, and by mid-October, Michelangelo prudently left for Venice. In early November, Piero was removed from power after surrendering key fortresses to Charles VIII. The son of Lorenzo the Magnificent acquired the less flattering epithet of Piero the Unfortunate on account of the manner in which he held power over the Florentine Republic for such a short period of time. After running out of money in Venice, Michelangelo began making his way back to Florence when the Bolognese aristocrat Gianfrancesco Aldrovandi recognized him and offered him free accommodation at his palazzo in Bologna. Michelangelo was soon commissioned to make 3 small statues for an elaborate new tomb of St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order. Without any further commissions, Michelangelo returned to Florence after a year. During his absence, the radical preacher Girolamo Savonarola had emerged as the most influential political figure in the city, instituting a kind of theocracy which reacted against the artistic and cultural renaissance Lorenzo the Magnificent had overseen in the city. Michelangelo nevertheless continued his work, creating an infant St. John the Baptist at this time and a sculpture of the sleeping Cupid, the god of love. While the latter piece was sold to Cardinal Raffaele Riario for 200 ducats, Michelangelo was outraged when the dealer only gave him 30 ducats. In 1496, Michelangelo received Riario's agent Jacopo Galli at his house and mesmerized the latter by drawing a hand with such grace and lightness. After confirming he was the sculptor of the sleeping Cupid, Michelangelo accompanied Galli to Rome and arrived on the 25th of June with a letter of recommendation from Lorenzo de Pierfrancesco de' Medici. Although Rome was the seat of the papacy, it was a shadow of its ancient past, and cultural life here was eclipsed by that of Florence. Cardinal Riario was among the church leaders who hoped to rebuild the city in the style of the Caesars. As soon as Michelangelo arrived at Rome, Riario invited him to examine his classical statue collection. The following day, he was commissioned to make statues of the wine god Bacchus and another of Cupid. Despite the promising start to his career in Rome, Michelangelo fell out with Riario after his drunken, staggering Bacchus proved too realistic for the cardinal's more refined tastes, and the statue ended up in Galli's collection. In his quest for alternative patrons, Michelangelo also re-established contact with Piero de' Medici, who was in Rome in the summer of 1497. Despite being short on funds, Piero may have commissioned a painting known as the Manchester Madonna, which is now on display in the National Gallery in London. While the painting was unfinished, it exhibits Michelangelo's mastery of human anatomy, but lacks the depth of other Florentine painters, such as Ghirlandaio. Michelangelo abandoned the painting when he was commissioned by Cardinal Jean-Billet de Lagrolla to make a sculpture for his funerary monument in St. Peter's Basilica. The French cardinal had been persuaded by Jacopo Galli, who promised him that the resulting creation will be the most beautiful marble that exists in Rome today. Michelangelo lived up to such expectations, and his Pietà, which depicts the dead Christ lying in the arms of the Virgin Mary, is one of his greatest masterpieces. Michelangelo received a princely sum of 450 ducats for the commission and left Rome for several months over the winter of 1497 to 1498 to select the Carrara marble. On his return to Rome, Michelangelo passed through Florence, where Savonarola's theocratic regime was approaching its final days. The fiery preacher was arrested in early April and executed on the 23rd of May. After the marble block arrived in June, Michelangelo spent 2 years carving the sculpture, which combined naturalism with classical beauty in an unprecedented fashion. One of the most intriguing aspects of Michelangelo's Pietà is the youthful appearance of the Virgin Mary, which lends poignancy to the sculpture. By July 1500, the Pietà was installed in the chapel of Saint Petronilla, though it was soon moved elsewhere when the chapel was demolished during rebuilding work. Michelangelo left a Latin inscription bearing his name on the Pietà, which made him a celebrity at the age of 25. Curiously, this is the only work he ever signed his name to. Not long after completing the sculpture, he began working on a painting of Christ being carried to his tomb, which he soon abandoned in favor of a more lucrative opportunity from his native Florence. For several decades, a block of Carrara marble intended for a colossal statue of David sat untouched in the Florentine Office of Works after the sculptor Agostino di Duccio made a poor start, blocking out the figure. As an underdog who defeated the giant Goliath, David was a popular subject in Florentine art. Other sculptors proposed to complete the statue of David by adding other pieces of marble, but Michelangelo aimed to maintain the purity of the single block of marble by depicting his David nude. By the time Michelangelo returned to Florence in spring 1501, Leonardo da Vinci had recently returned to the city from Milan. Leonardo was commissioned to make a large painting of the Madonna and Child with Saint Anne, and exhibited his preliminary drawing for the picture. Michelangelo was among those who saw the drawing on public display, but little is otherwise known about his interaction with the 49-year-old Leonardo on this occasion. By September, Michelangelo began carving David, one of his greatest masterpieces in stone. A few months later, he built a hut around the marble so he could work in secret while allowing only a few select visitors to check on his progress. The statue of David was originally intended to stand on the roof of Florence Cathedral, but as it took shape, the Florentine dignitaries decided that it deserved a more prominent location, though it was also the case that the nude image was considered to be a potentially problematic addition to a religious site. The way this was decided was complex. Following the instability of the Savonarola years, the Florentines elected an official to serve as gonfaloniere for life in autumn 1502. The man in question was Piero Soderini, a politician who had been close to both Lorenzo the Magnificent and Savonarola. Soderini became a close friend of Michelangelo and hoped that the statue of David would stand near the Palazzo della Signoria, now known as the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of the Florentine government and Soderini's permanent residence. By June 1503, the statue was almost complete and exhibited in the Office of Works, but its final position was still undetermined. In January 1504, a committee of artists including Da Vinci and Sandro Botticelli met to consider the location of the statue. While it was agreed that the statue should stand closer to ground level, where Michelangelo's detail could be easily appreciated, the issue was not only artistic but political. A position near the cathedral would elevate the prestige of the church, while its placement near the Palazzo Vecchio would do the same for Soderini's government. The meeting did not come to a clear conclusion, but in May 1504, David was transported to the Piazza della Signoria outside the palace. The sculpture was not universally admired, and its critics included Leonardo, who considered the naked statue vulgar. The Florentines agreed, and David was taken into the courtyard of the Palazzo della Signoria, where it was formally unveiled in September. In focusing on David, Michelangelo had been compelled to set aside other commissions. In May 1501, Galli had secured Michelangelo a new commission from Cardinal Francesco Tedeschini Piccolomini for 14 statues for the Piccolomini altarpiece in Siena Cathedral, which he intended as his own tomb. By summer 1503, when the ailing cardinal made his will, Michelangelo had failed to deliver any statues. After Pope Alexander VI died in August, Piccolomini was elected Pope Pius III a month later, but he lasted less than a month and died in October 1503. While the late Pope was buried at the Vatican, his heirs demanded completion of the altarpiece. By the following October, Michelangelo delivered 4 statues, but never completed the remainder. The quality of the work was substandard, suggesting that he had little interest in the commission. In August 1502, Michelangelo also agreed to make a copy of Donatello's bronze statue of David for the Florentine government as a gift to the French soldier Pierre de Rohanguy. Michelangelo had never worked in bronze before and missed several deadlines for completion, prompting several exasperated letters from Niccolò Machiavelli, then a senior diplomat of the Florentine government. The bronze was cast by October 1503, but remained in a rough state for several years. Michelangelo's failure to meet his deadlines caused great diplomatic embarrassment for Florence, and the bronze was only completed several years later by another artist. Throughout this period, Michelangelo was also in competition with Leonardo. The two men, both venerated by posterity, disagreed violently about art. Leonardo considered painting the nobler discipline, while Michelangelo asserted that sculpture required a greater skill. While Leonardo preferred softer lines and used light and shadow to create emotion in his paintings, Michelangelo's paintings are distinguished by sharp outlines and bright colors. With two of the greatest artists in history available, Soderini commissioned Leonardo and Michelangelo to each paint a large battle scene in the great council chamber of the Palazzo della Signoria. Leonardo was to depict the victory of a Florentine-led coalition over the Milanese at the Battle of Anghiari of 1449, while Michelangelo was given the Battle of Cascina in 1364. The Florentine army had been bathing in the river Arno when they were surprised by their Pisan enemy, but nevertheless emerged victorious. The subject matter suited Michelangelo's ability to represent nude male figures in different poses. Both Leonardo and Michelangelo made detailed cartoons of their scenes, and while Leonardo sniped at his younger rival's muscular figures for resembling what he called a sack of walnuts, he was still motivated to carry out his own anatomical studies afterwards to gain a better understanding of Michelangelo's methods. Neither fresco was completed, as Leonardo left for Milan in May 1506, while Michelangelo had not started painting when he was summoned to Rome in February 1505 by Pope Julius II, formerly Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. Julius is known to history as an ambitious statesman who led armies into battle and broke the power of Cesare Borgia, the son of his rival, the deceased Pope Alexander VI, and the ruler of a large duchy in central Italy that he had carved out there during his father's time as Bishop of Rome. Julius asked Michelangelo to build for him a grand 3-level tomb in St. Peter's Basilica, incorporating 40 life-size statues. After being assured of full financial backing from the Vatican, Michelangelo spent 8 months sourcing marble at Carrara. During his absence, Julius launched an even grander project, the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica itself by his architect Donato Bramante. When Michelangelo returned to Rome in January 1506, he witnessed the rediscovery of a celebrated Roman statue of the Trojan priest Laocoon and his sons being attacked by serpents as a punishment from the gods for advising the Trojans not to accept the Trojan horse as a gift. It was found buried in Rome and excavated. Within a few months, Michelangelo realized that the Pope was losing interest in his tomb, as Julius instead asked the sculptor to repaint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, initially built by his uncle Pope Sixtus IV during the 1470s, but already in disrepair. However, Michelangelo continued to demand money for the tomb from Julius, who was planning a military campaign. When Julius refused to receive Michelangelo, the frustrated and humiliated artist left for Florence in April, prompting the pontiff to send a party of horsemen to bring him back. Michelangelo had already entered Florentine territory by the time they caught up with him and refused their entreaties, informing them that he would never return to Rome. He believed that his rival, Donato Bramante, was behind the Sistine Chapel commission to distract him from working on the tomb. In fact, Bramante advised against commissioning Michelangelo since the latter was untested as a fresco painter. The Pope insisted on Michelangelo's return and put pressure on the Florentine government to facilitate it. In desperation, the artist even considered going to Constantinople to help Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II build a bridge across the Golden Horn, but dropped the plans after being informed that there would be no demand for sculptures of human figures. Soderini eventually prevailed upon Michelangelo to make his peace with the Pope. In November, Michelangelo met Julius in Bologna, which the pontiff had returned to papal control through decisive military action. Julius desired an appropriate monument to celebrate his triumph, and Michelangelo agreed to cast a large bronze equestrian statue for the Pope in Bologna. The monument lasted less than 4 years before the Bolognese expelled the papal garrison in December 1511 and melted down the statue. After completing the equestrian statue for Julius in March 1508, Michelangelo returned to Florence rather than to Rome. He soon received an urgent summons from the Pope to work on the Sistine Chapel. With St. Peter's far from completion, Julius needed a venue to say Mass, and the chapel's cracked ceiling reflected poorly on the papacy. Under the terms of the original commission, agreed in May 1508, Michelangelo was to paint the 12 apostles in the semicircular lunettes on either side of the vault, while the rest of the ceiling was to have an elaborate geometric pattern. Michelangelo was already familiar with the subject matter, since in 1503 he had been commissioned to produce sculptures of the 12 for Florence Cathedral, but by the time of his summons to Rome in 1505, he had only completed St. Matthew. In order to work without disturbing services in the chapel, Michelangelo designed a series of bridges spanning the vault to accommodate the scaffolding built by his friend Piero Rosselli. After Michelangelo climbed onto the scaffolding in July to appreciate the geometry of the ceiling, he realized that the original conception of the 12 apostles was too simple. He proposed a far more ambitious scheme inspired by the Old Testament. The sides of the vault would feature paintings of the ancestors of Christ. The area between the windows was decorated with enthroned prophets or sibyls who foretold the birth of Christ, while the central area was divided into 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, including the creation of the world, the birth of Adam, and Noah and the Great Flood. Michelangelo asked his friend, the painter Francesco Granacci, to recruit a team of experienced Florentine fresco painters to help him with the ceiling. Starting with the section depicting the Great Flood, the team had to work quickly while the plaster was still wet. However, the plaster they used was too wet and mold began to develop. Following the setback, Michelangelo asked to be relieved of his duties, but the Pope urged him to continue. Much of the fresco had to be removed and repainted. Michelangelo dismissed his helpers and carried on with a smaller team who helped him mix plaster and paint the less important areas, while he personally painted all the scenes and figures. While he was creating his divine masterpiece, perhaps the best-known ceiling painting of all time, Michelangelo complained incessantly about his working conditions in letters to his family. Contrary to popular belief, he painted standing up rather than lying on his back, but was forced to tilt his head backwards. Michelangelo's relationship with his papal patron remained difficult, as the Pope constantly requested progress updates. But by the time the artist was ready to unveil the first half of the ceiling, the Pope had gone to Bologna to raise an army against his erstwhile ally France. When Michelangelo went to Bologna to demand payment from him in late 1510, Julius was seriously ill. He recovered, but his campaign ended in disaster, and by the time he returned to Rome in June 1511, the Sistine Chapel remained a low priority. Starved of funds, Michelangelo made the cartoons for the remaining half of the ceiling, including the creation of Adam and the separation of light from darkness, but also had spare time to write poetry. In addition to his other artistic endeavors, Michelangelo was a renowned poet who wrote over 300 poems during his lifetime. His verses from the early 1510s were among his earliest and criticized both the Pope and corruption in the Church. Michelangelo's troublesome relationship with Julius may also have been motivated by the Pope's patronage of the younger Raphael, whom he commissioned to decorate his private suite in the Apostolic Palace with a series of frescoes between 1509 and 1511. While Raphael's famous School of Athens features prominent thinkers from the ancient world, he based several of the figures on contemporary artists. In the center of the scene, Leonardo is depicted as Plato, pointing his finger towards the heavens, while the seated, brooding figure of Heraclitus in the foreground is reminiscent of Michelangelo's prophets on the Sistine Chapel ceiling and is understood as Raphael's tribute to his great rival. In October 1511, conscious of his own advancing years, Julius gave Michelangelo 400 ducats to finish work on the ceiling as quickly as he could. Michelangelo proceeded to paint the creation of Adam, a task that took him only 16 days. Without artistic precedent, Michelangelo depicted God as an elderly, bearded man, stretching out his right arm to impart the spark of life on the recumbent nude Adam. God is surrounded by a group of human figures, understood to represent the entire human race, within a billowing red cloth shaped like the human brain. While the dozens of male nudes are among the most striking features of Michelangelo's ceiling, their depiction was consistent with artistic and theological currents in Rome. The painted nudes, particularly the 20 ignudi sat on plinths between the main scenes, are inspired by classical statues, while church leaders also regarded nudity in terms of the perfection of God's creation. As a sign of his growing confidence, Michelangelo worked freehand to paint the last of his Genesis scenes, the separation of light from darkness, within a single day. The ceiling was completed in late October 1512 and unveiled on the 31st to the satisfaction of the Pope, who paid Michelangelo the final installment of his 3,000 ducat fee in December. While Michelangelo was painting the heavens, there had been major developments in the earthly realm. Although a papal Spanish army had been defeated by the French at Ravenna on the 11th of April 1512, the death of the French commander Gaston de Foix prevented the French from consolidating control of northern Italy. The balance of power shifted in favor of Julius's Holy League after the arrival of 18,000 Swiss mercenaries. This enabled the papal Spanish forces to overthrow Soderini's pro-French Republican government in Florence and restore the Medici under Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici and his younger brother Giuliano. A few months later, Julius fell ill and died in February 1513, shortly after paying Michelangelo 2,000 ducats to continue work on his tomb, and leaving instructions to be buried next to his uncle Sixtus IV until its completion. Michelangelo and the late Pope's executors negotiated a modified but equally ambitious design for the tomb, valued at 16,500 ducats. Meanwhile, Medici fortunes received a further boost when the 37-year-old Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X. Although Michelangelo had known the new pope during the days of Lorenzo the Magnificent, he and Leo did not get along. Thus, while Leo patronized Leonardo and Raphael, he showed Michelangelo no particular favor, but allowed him to continue work on his predecessor's tomb. Among the sculptures Michelangelo made for the tomb between 1513 and 1516 were The Rebellious Slave and The Dying Slave, iconic male nudes now on display in the Louvre in Paris. Michelangelo also created his Moses, a stern, bearded figure which ended up being the focus of the final tomb after its design was scaled down. Even in its more modest form, the tomb would not be completed for another 3 decades and would never accommodate Julius's body. By 1515, Michelangelo was becoming impatient with the tomb since he expected to receive major commissions from Pope Leo. Further political developments also contributed to Michelangelo's desire to cast the tomb aside. As a cardinal, Pope Leo had been one of Pope Julius's chief lieutenants, but relations between the Medici and della Rovere families deteriorated in 1516, when Leo deposed Julius's nephew, Francesco Maria della Rovere, as Duke of Urbino in favor of his own nephew Lorenzo, the 23-year-old son of the unfortunate Piero de' Medici, who was also due to take over the Florentine government. With the della Roveres in decline, Michelangelo negotiated a less ambitious design, with only 21 statues, without any reduction in his fee. In the meantime, Michelangelo ingratiated himself with Domenico Buoninsegni, secretary to Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, the Pope's cousin and chief advisor. The Pope wanted to commission a facade for the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence, the family's ancestral church, and was persuaded by Buoninsegni to give Michelangelo the job. Since Michelangelo had little architectural experience, he was expected to focus on the sculptures, with the structural aspects entrusted to the architect Baccio Biggio. After agreeing terms in December 1515, Michelangelo quickly sidelined Baccio and decided to study the principles of classical architecture himself. After making initial drawings, he delivered a wooden model to Rome in December 1517, which received papal approval. In January 1518, Michelangelo signed a contract with the Pope to build the facade for 40,000 ducats. For the next 2 years, he supervised